Hello everyone. I'm Manu Jain Goyal, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's session. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Evgeny Bobrov from Quest Center for Responsible Research. Today, Dr. Bobrov will talk about how journal editors can support data availability, and which is one of my favorite topics. So I'm very excited today to hearing from Dr. Bobrov. Dr. Bobrov is the team lead for open data and research data management at the Quest Center for Responsible Research in Berlin. This is affiliated with Institute of Health at Share. In this role, he leads key efforts to monitor data sharing and reuse practices, as well as to develop workflows for assessing data availability. His expertise includes a particular focus on the sharing of personal data, where he not only advises on responsible ways to make sensitive data accessible, but also contributes to broader discussions on the future of study data availability. With his deep knowledge and hands-on experience, Dr. Bobrov is uniquely positioned to shed light on both the challenges and opportunities in this important area. So without taking further time, please welcome Dr. Evgeny Bobrov. So stage is all yours, Dr. Bobrov.
Very much. So let me share the slides then and jump right in. As everybody will be aware, it's a webinar format, so I can't see you, but Manu Goyal or Dr. Goyal will be moderating, and then I will be aware of your questions, and of course we will have a discussion section in the end.
So at the end of the session, we will take the questions. You can leave your questions in the Q&A section, and we will take the questions from there.
So yes, so this is the title of my talk, How Can My Journal Support Data Availability? And I really hope that in the end of this talk, you will take with you some concrete recommendations and inspirations for how to advance data sharing in your positions. And yeah, I would be really excited if we can also go into discussion about challenges and opportunities later. And so this is a journey today in seven bus stops, so to say. And I really hope that along this journey, I will be able to pick up everybody. Maybe the early stops will be a little bit repetitive for some of you who might be really very deep in this topic already. But I hope that along the way, everybody will find something interesting. So, and I should also mention that I have made an effort to base all of my statements and the whole kind of argument for the problems, for the possibilities, and the recommendations as far as possible in the literature. And so this is quite a let's say talk focused and grounded in the literature. And in many cases, of course, this is just one article, but there are many more. So I think that all of this is pretty well researched. And so much of it is not something that my personal opinion is, but I hope is really grounded in studies. So first of all, and this is why I said maybe some of you don't need more information or more kind of being convinced about it, but I would like to briefly introduce the position that data sets are valuable and should be made available. So this is something that, as you can see, I've borrowed from a publisher, and my point is not to go through all of these blobs, but rather to have a very big summary slide which shows that there is a value in data sharing, which is on the level of individual researchers, on the level of research communities, and on the level of society. And I think some of this, even in this slide, might be a little bit repetitive, but there are many very good reasons for why data should be shared. And importantly, what has been shown in the last years is that data which has been shared is also being reused on a massive scale. So this is a very nice study from a few years back. And this study looked at the sharing of neuroimaging data and how it has been reused. And they provide evidence that there is an impact of open sharing of brain imaging data, and that this results in peer-reviewed publications, and that in fact the prejudice, as they state, that or the myth that articles based on reused data cannot be published in high impact journals. It's actually not true. So, and this is also something that we observe in our work at the Charité, which is a university medical hospital. We do see that data reuse, often in combination with new data creation, is something very common and also published in high impact journals. And ourselves, so I don't have a figure on that now. This is work in progress, but we are looking at how data sets shared by our researchers are being reused. And for 3 years or 4 years, data sets shared by our researchers have been referenced way more than 1,000 times in the literature. And I mean, this is also methodologically, I think, quite interesting, but I'm not focusing on that today, how we're getting these numbers. So this is just a brief overview. There is much more work on how data is being reused, both on the kind of like large scale, but also very individual granular descriptions of specific examples, for example, for the reuse of clinical study data. So after hopefully I have taken you along on the first stop, the data is something that should be shared. I think it's kind of logical and connected to it to claim that researchers should be sharing data. And pretty much everybody in the science system says it. International organizations, as importantly the UNESCO, are saying it. And as a side note, I myself, I'm involved in the Open Science Monitoring Initiative, which is closely working with UNESCO to support organizations and states with open science monitoring. And among these open science knowledge practices, of course, the sharing of research data is extremely important. Funders are also saying it. For example, the DFG, the main German research funder, is stating that data should be made available as long as it's possible. And this should be raw data so that it can be reused by third parties. And also our institution, as so many other institutions, says, for example, in our charter on good scientific practice, that when results are published, data should also be shared where it is possible and adequate. So, of course, there are many constraints, and I will briefly come back also to the issue of personal data in one slide. But the general consensus is that where possible, data should be made available. And of course, journals are also saying this is just one editorial which states that, but there are many more in the same vein. And importantly, there has been a study which looks at researcher views and opinions and how they're impacted by different norms or requirements. And it has shown that researchers would follow journal requirements, and that these journal requirements indeed would be particularly important for them to start sharing data. So in this study, they show that what they call regulative pressure, I'm not sure regulative is the perfect word, but some kind of expectation by journals was found to have significant influences on, this is specifically biological scientists' data sharing behaviors. So having considered the points of view that data sharing is good as a value as such, and also from this follows that researchers should be doing this, I will briefly make a short stop at the question of which data sets should be shared. I think this is something that has not been very much researched, but in my opinion, data sets which underlie research articles published in journals are particularly valuable. And this might not be universally true in the same way for all disciplines, but I think in biomedicine, this is most probably the case. Partly because researchers typically find data sets through articles, at least right now this is the case, and also because the review of the article itself, also even if no particular data review takes place, just the fact that the article has been reviewed already kind of translates to a certain increase in trust also towards the data set. And lastly, in addition to the possible new uses of the data set, the fact that it has been shared with an article also creates an additional value because this can also be used to reproduce the findings in the article. So for all of these reasons, I think that at this point, and at least for biomedicine, it's fair to assume that data sets underlying research articles are particularly valuable to share. So now, having said this more general stage, I would like to approach something where I'm addressing you more directly. And this is about first what journals are already doing, and then in the next section, what journals could be doing additionally. So it is definitely the case that the journals are already taking steps, and I will be happy to hear maybe in the discussion more about concrete steps that you're taking in your work, because also I must say, of course, I don't know who's exactly in the talk and your exact roles. So something that is very visible in the last years is a very steep increase in the presence of data availability statements. And I think most of you will be aware that these are brief sections in journals which specifically state whether and which data have been shared. And so there are different, I mean, this is a very obvious effect. So it has been shown multiple times. The state of open data report is actually something that has been published by publishers for a few years now, every year. And they also look at the increase in data availability statements. The adoption of data sharing policies, which I will come back to later, is something that is already taking place by many journals. And this study, for example, looked at which journals have adopted data sharing policies. And by data sharing policies, this is just a policy which addresses data sharing. It doesn't at all mean that it is a mandatory policy. So they looked at different fields of science. And for example, so this is not exactly biomedical, but neuroscience definitely has some overlap with it. And they found that in the journal sample, they looked at the majority had adopted some kind of data sharing policy. And many journals also already include recommendations for authors for how to handle data. And sometimes that's also tied to their data sharing policy. So it kind of helps them to implement the data sharing policy. So all of these things are definitely happening, and surely many more. But I think, and I hope you will maybe agree with me that journals can do still more in supporting data availability. And one particular thing that has been or is being discussed a lot in our community of open data sharing is that in many journals it is quite common to find a statement that data are available upon request. And this is something that is unfortunately not really working. So it has been studied and shown over and over that in the majority of cases, if authors state the data are available upon request, unfortunately, it's actually not really available. So there are many studies where researchers try to access the data and it just doesn't work. So this is another study on that, and they explicitly state, we observed that statements of data availability upon request are inefficient and should not be allowed by journals. So um, I'm not sure we should go as far as to say they shouldn't be allowed. I mean, ideally there would be other ways, but maybe in certain circumstances they should be banned altogether. Definitely, as I will come back to, as long as data can be shared and there are no personal data restrictions, I think there should be definitely better ways. And even if it's personal restrictions, that is also important to consider. Either data can be shared with in a certain way or they cannot, but this upon request. If the problem is the data are personal, the request will not really help to solve this problem. So I think this is actually kind of cannot really be the argument. And I think that authors should describe whether data are shared in a repository, and if they're not, how data exactly should be requested and what needs to be kind of given as an information to really receive the data. including, importantly, a functional address, because if it's just one address of a person, it's just too probable that this address is going to go offline at a certain point. Another thing is that applying and introducing journal data policies is a good first step, but unfortunately, it's not sufficient. And it has been shown that researchers are not universally compliant with their data sharing statements and with journal data policies, which is not the same thing, but is related, because typically authors formulate the data sharing statement in a way which is compliant with the data sharing policy or data policy in general. So in this study, the authors state that when authors indicate that they will share the data upon request, the compliance rates with actual sharing are actually the same as if the authors didn't state it at all. And in another study, which also looked at data sharing and journal data policies, the two main results, as the authors state, indicate that it is not sufficient for journals to merely announce a data sharing requirement. I'm very aware that actually monitoring data sharing is much more complicated. So this is definitely not an easy step to do. But as journals, I would really call upon everybody to be aware that just introducing a data policy is not sufficient. And something that journals can do something indirectly, as follows from the previous points, is that data sharing in repositories is still very low. So for our institution, we find that about 10%, which is an increase, but still a very small fraction of articles have shared data in repositories, either openly or under restrictions, but with a defined access pathway. So importantly, this is of course not, or to me, this is a matter of course, they do not include upon request sharing statements, which would immediately increase this to 50, 60, or 70%. But the actual sharing in repositories still remains relatively exceptional. And I already see 13 comments. I don't know if these are questions, but I hope so. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. But let me take you along for the last two stops. So from what I said before, what follows as suggestions for how your journal can support with data availability? So first of all, and this will be partly mirroring what I have presented before as first steps. If you don't have a journal policy, I would recommend you to adopt one. And ideally, it should be a standardized data policy, which I think saves you time, but also makes it more compatible with other journals and saves authors time for compliance. So the Research Data Alliance, which is an international organization which is active in the convergence with regard to different data management activities, has in one interest group developed a research data policy framework for journals and publishers. And in this framework, they define and describe 14 features, which cluster into overall 6 sets of different levels of journal policies. So from very loose and rather low, let's say low grade, not low grade, not the right word, but relatively low expectation policies towards maximally very stringent policy with very high expectations. You can choose one of these 6 levels. Then also importantly, and this is something which I haven't talked before, so I will dwell on it a little bit more. Journals, in my opinion, should do and could relatively easily do more with regard to data citation. So right now, the question is, how do you refer to data that has been either shared or reused? And I think this is extremely important to do it properly, because this is how authors of data sets can receive recognition. So there are two ways that one could distinguish. One of them is referring to data sets shared or reused. I'll come back to that in a minute in the data availability statement, as we have discussed before. But in addition, And this is actually best practice is to include references to data sets which are shared online in the references section. And for this, there has been the Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles. And this declaration states that data should be considered legitimate, citable products of research, and that citations should be accorded the same importance in the scholarly record as is the case for journals and articles and other research outputs. So I think this is very important because so far this is hardly ever followed by authors. And this might not always be intuitive for authors, which I acknowledge, but I think that if journals consequently follow this up and recommend this to authors and make them aware of this and maybe use semi-automated tools also to flag that to authors, I think this can be solved relatively easily. So I would really recommend that at this point you request authors to do both things. So on the one hand, to include data citations in the references, but also at the same time, for now at least, to include a statement about data in the data availability statement. So this might be a little bit of a repetitive thing, but the effort isn't really that large. And this way, one can really make sure that both the citation record, but also human readers will be definitely aware of data sets. And one important thing to highlight, which is that one should cite both reused data sets and one's own data sets. So this is not always intuitive to authors because they're always afraid that they might be kind of self-citing and that this will backfire. But this is not citing their own articles in an inflated way. This is rather best practice to make sure that they refer to their own digital data sets in a proper way. So this is very much a good thing. And this is important to highlight to authors. And data availability statements, which most journals have, if you don't have it, of course, included, and please make it a separate section so that it can be easily found. And advise, it should be with an S, please advise authors to include the reused data sets as well. Because in the end, what a reader of the article is interested in is the data sets which underlie the article. And whether this is an own data set or a reused data set is not necessarily the primary interest. So I think it should always be in the data availability statement. And then if you have policies, then of course, please also recommend repositories to authors and importantly recommend them instead of supplementary data. Supplementary data have many disadvantages. They're not really findable in themselves. They're not citable. They don't have any data set specific metadata. So please recommend repositories rather than supplementary information. And this statement here by this disciplinary society also mentions the FAIR principles. I'm not going into that in detail, but most are probably aware that this is a framework which describes in a high-level way principles which make data sets reusable. And then also the fact that, or my statement that information about data sharing and appropriate repositories should be provided to authors is also corroborated by this 2020 State of Open Data report, which conducted a survey amongst researchers, and they found that of all the venues and ways in which authors could get recommendations about data sharing, the publisher was considered the most important venue, or as it's phrased here, the venue where they would primarily go to receive help that they require. So I'm aware that this is a survey done by publishers, so there might be a bias, but I think there's at least an indication that researchers want publishers to provide this information and trust publishers in doing so. And now this is more an advanced thing to do, and I know that this is more difficult, but I would encourage you to ask reviewers to at least have a look at the data. It doesn't necessarily have to be data review in the full sense of the word, but just to click on at the data set, see that the link is functioning, that maybe a few information is there, that the data set maybe has at least a README file, that so just some basic things. Um, this is very valuable, and this will also, I think, kind of improve the research system as a whole, because reviewers, of course, also again are researchers. So I think that if they spend 5 more minutes opening the data set and looking at it very, very briefly, this will be good for the review process, but I think actually it will also be a good thing overall. And I know that there's a lot of pressure on reviewers, and I'm aware of the complications. And so the authors of this article, they're also stating that indeed a proper data publication review, which is not what I'm arguing for now, but it would be ideal to conduct a more in-depth review of the data set. This would definitely increase the stress, as the authors say, on the scientific publishing system, but they also say that if done properly, it will also increase the trustworthiness and value of both data sets, but also the articles based on these data sets. And lastly, I should also mention there are definitely concerns and restrictions with regard to the sharing of personal data. And of course, in biomedical research, that's extremely important. And indeed, this article found that for 89 articles which declared the data would be available, the data would be stored in repositories, so not upon request. In the end, actually, only 19% had indeed deposited data. And they found out that mostly this was because of embargo periods, which is something that authors can implement in repositories because they want to postpone the publication, but also, and this is more to the point that I'm making, because of regulatory approval procedures. So even if authors want to share data, often they cannot easily, and especially in Germany, it's definitely a valid and important concern. So I would really recommend that you do accommodate the restrictions of authors, but that you also recommend to them at least to share the data that they can. For example, certain genetic data can be shared in repositories like the European Genome Phenome Archive, which allows the restricted access sharing of data. And in the next years, more and more such restricted access venues are expected to come. And also, I think it is definitely to be expected from authors to state that if they cannot share data, this is because of, at least they should state it's because of data protection restrictions, but ideally, even more specifically, is it because the data are not considered anonymous enough? Is it because they did not obtain the consent? This will really help also the people who approach them later for data reuse. And this will also help to propel generally the discussion also with the data protection authorities. So these were my recommendations. And in the last brief section before I'll come to the summary, I will like to highlight two things which might also be relevant to you from a general perspective. So actually, it has been now shown repetitively. Just today, actually, there was a new preprint which again looked at this and found it. So there is a robust open data citation advantage, which means that there is a correlation between the sharing of underlying data sets and the citation counts that a research article receives. We should definitely be aware of the caveat that this is not a causal analysis. So none of these articles claims that there is a causal relation between these two things, but there is definitely a correlation, which is very robust, in that data sharing is associated with more highly cited articles. So there might at least be some causality in it, for example, through some trust effect. And secondly, if with all the criticism that impact factors, of course, receive in the meta research discussion, I do think that probably for journals they do still have value. So I assume that they still are certainly prominent in your discussions. And in that regard, I wanted to mention the data availability is also correlated, not necessarily causally related, but correlated with higher impact factors. So the journals with high impact factors have been found to have more often data sharing policies, to have more articles with shared data and more often conduct data peer review. So this is something, and of course, I think it is obvious that these journals also have more resources to conduct these things. I'm aware of that, but I wanted to mention this finding as well. So I hope that along the trip, everybody had some studies and some arguments and motivations that were new and interesting. And I would like to finish with a very brief summary of what I would recommend journals can do with regard to data availability. Um, to start with, I would recommend to adopt a data policy, to provide repository recommendations, and to advise authors against using upon request statements. And if you want to go further, I would recommend to instruct authors to use repositories and not just supplementary data, which is, I think, still a relatively early thing to do. And then more complex is to ensure that authors cite data properly. And definitely, of my recommendations, the most complex would be to ask reviewers to look at data. Although I should say that if we're not conducting or not talking about proper data review, but just a brief look at the data, I think this is still well manageable. So, yes, I would now be at the end. Thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, we have time for discussion now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evgeny, for such a wonderful talk. I find a lot of important recommendations and informations were given. Yeah, and I totally agree that data citation is equally very important, not just the publications. And yeah, we should not yeah, it's not sufficient just to make data available in the supplementary information. They should be deposited in the repository so that they are clearly available to reuse for further researchers. And journals should have clear and structured guideline for the author so that they can follow to deposit their data. Yes, so we have a lot of questions. So I would take a first question. So should the data sharing be field specific, physical science versus social science versus medical science? I mean, or so it has to be field specific, or it can be like for general all the journals.
So I think that generally the goal of making data available is not field specific, but definitely the state of the different disciplines and also the steps that we should take accordingly are different. So, as you will, of course, be aware from your different disciplines, in some cases, like physics, it is very common to share data, at least in certain disciplines of physics. And in some cases, it's even understood. There isn't much discussion even about this. In other cases, it's very rare. And definitely personal data are one constraint, but again, in basic research, it's easier because typically it's not so commercially valuable or not so immediately commercially valuable. So this is another concern that people sometimes have, although typically I think it's not justified, but it can be a concern in some cases. Definitely, whether researchers work in large consortia, the more people are involved, the more difficult it typically becomes to take such decisions. So I think that it is generally something we should strive for in all fields. But it definitely, when you're in a community which has already 50, 60, 70% data sharing, then I think you could go along the way, all the way, and make it a requirement. If you're in a community where this is the exception, you should probably start with small steps like I outlined.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. We have another question from Eva. She says, I would say that evaluation of data sets is a major issue. Who should be responsible for data accuracy, authors, reviewers, or editors, or all of them? Are there some recommendations for reviewers on how to evaluate data sets? Because in my opinion, reviewing data sets is a problem for many journals. Yes, I do also see that.
Uh, well, I think that data review is not extensively researched, so I don't have very strong like basis for my opinions on this. Um, from my experience also at consulting researchers on data sets and looking at data sets that researchers have published, I think that there would probably be two answers. Like something that could be relatively easily, I think, done in the editorial process would be some technical checks, especially with regard to metadata. But then again, this is something that repositories anyway do. So I think as soon as you move away from upon request data and supplementary data and towards data repositories, you will, for the most part, already have some very basic metadata included. Um, so this might already be partly solved, but it's definitely worthwhile in the editorial process to look at whether, for example, if that you make a requirement the data sets are shared with an open license, and can be checked in a minute, at least for common repositories. But I'm aware that, for example, in a community which doesn't go to just 2 or 3 repositories, but might have different and dozens of repositories, it might again be more complicated. So it's difficult to give a very general, non-field specific recommendation. Now, when we're talking about actual data review and like looking at the data set itself, that's a much bigger issue. I think that's very difficult at this point to implement for journals. And I would recommend that if you have a community where data is being reused and shared a lot, you really include one reviewer which has this as her or his primary task and maybe doesn't come necessarily from research so much as from a research infrastructure, because these people will have the expertise to see whether tables are properly formatted, have the right information about the different fields, are machine readable, whether formats are kind of compatible. And this also go, of course, along with the review of code, which is yet another big issue in some fields. This might be more relevant than the review of data. So to not make my answer very long, I think the proper data review needs to be worked through properly. And I think there are best practices from some journals, but it's not very common. And I'm also not really an expert on how their experiences are. So, but it is something that would require more implementation and I think would require additional extra data reviewers.
We have another question related to this from Dr. Paresh. So reviewers will only be able to review the data if they have appropriate software to do so. And very often they do not have resources, unfortunately. So
Yeah, but this goes into this direction. So even if you don't look at the data properly, but just to make sure, for example, that data are not shared in SPSS, but are shared at least also in a CSV file or at least an Excel file, but it should be ideally an CSV file. And similar issues of commercial software, it's typically not a problem at all for the authors to export it into an open format. So this is the minimal thing that should be ensured. Even if nobody looks at the data set, just make sure that the format is open.
Yeah. We have another question from Zaidun. How can we assure for authors that their data will be safe and cited properly? And another question, also what if the data used by another authors before the original author get their manuscript published?
So the second question is typically answered by just the timeline of the data publishing. So typically, authors publish the data only around the time point that they publish the manuscript.
Right.
If they are concerned, they can also include an embargo period in some repositories, but not all. It's possible, unfortunately. So which means that the data are deposited, but then they go online a bit later. I'm aware that in some cases, authors might want to publish multiple manuscripts based on the data, which might cause concern. I do see that there is a tension, but I would definitely argue that in most cases, the advantage that these fears are largely overblown because the advantage of the authors is just they're so far ahead of everybody else. They know their data sets and the study so much better that except for maybe very few super competitive fields where they know somebody else is like head on head with them, very probably this is not a real issue, but I would not universally dismiss it because it might be an issue sometimes. And
Yeah.
the first question was how to ensure that
Mm,
researchers are cited properly and receive recognition. Um, well, again, this is something that journals should include in the policy, that if you reuse data set, you should cite it. And of course, again, if researchers share the data in a repository, this is much more easily cited than some data set which is a supplement or so, or even like privately communicated. So I think that's again a kind of big topic. Largely, it's also a cultural shift because everybody in the research community should be aware that using data sets also requires recognition. But I think that by now, because I'm screening the literature for our institution and I see that data reuse is indicated hundreds of times over, so I think actually researchers are trying to give it justice.
okay. Yeah. And we have another question from Hano. The sample size is very important with the methods of sampling. So I don't know what you trying. I don't understand this question, but maybe what I understand is if the sample size is important to deposit the data, if there are large sample size or the small sample size. And then there is a small another question is from the Hano is survey monkey true resource of data? Survey monkey, I think.
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly about sample sizes, generally, yes, I would agree that if that's what you're saying or asking,
Yeah,
that data sets which are large and have large sample sizes generally can be reused better.
yeah,
On the other hand, small sample sizes can also be synthesized into larger or reused. So it is, I think, universally valuable to share data. But if you're talking about resource allocation, I think that resources should be allocated more towards large data sets because they over proportionally get reused more. SurveyMonkey, I mean, I can't really say. I mean, it's a way of collecting data. Whether it's a good data source or not, I guess depends on how you use it.
right. I also have one question. How can journal balance enforcing strong data availability requirements without discouraging submissions? Because many of times I also experience, because I'm also working for the journal and I'm responsible for the data availability and data integrity part, that many of the authors, they withdrew their manuscripts because it's a lot of work to submit their data to data repository. So how can we find that balance? Is there any suggestions for
Yeah,
like?
I mean, I'm typically on the other end of the line because I receive the request from authors who get the request from the journal and they do want to comply. So they're asking me, for example, how could they de-identify the data or what is feasible. But in a few cases, I also had to help them draft a kind of rebuttal, so to say, to the journal, which is basically a short answer why they could not share the data and
Yeah.
also an appropriate statement for data availability. So this goes a little bit in the direction of what I recommended, that if there are legitimate reasons in your field, and it doesn't have always to be personal data. For example, a common case is also for the biodiversity data. You might not want to share all data about some endangered species, or there might be many other cases why you don't want to share data, maybe for ethical reasons, at least not with
Mhm.
everybody. So um, and in many cases, of course, you also cannot share data because you reuse them, so it's not up to you. So, well, I think you should be accommodating of this and just try to be in a exchange with authors about is there a subset of the data? Is there a kind of level of the data that can be shared? It doesn't maybe have to be all the raw data, but just
Mhm.
some data. Um,
Some
and at
information.
least as a minimal thing, if it's quantitative research, there should be the data points underlying figures because these are already derived data. It's basically what's in the figures. So at least
Yeah.
this is something that should be published or shared. This is something that some publishers call the source data. This is
Mhm.
definitely not what I typically mean by raw data, but it can already help to do meta-analysis. So yes, I think it depends again on the field, but be accommodating and I don't think that I think that mostly you will be able to, and if authors are adamant just we can't do it, then I guess you have to say please describe why you can't, and please try to do it next time.
Okay, yeah. And in during your talk, you suggest that we should not, or the journal should stop accepting this data availability statement that data will be shared upon request. But then there are some studies where you might see that there is no specific data which can be deposited, or you don't find suitable repository. And then sometimes authors will write, or they do write, that data can be shared upon request. And what do you recommend instead of writing upon request? What should be implemented?
So you mean if there is no data deposit and
Yeah.
but the authors have the data and they would be willing to share it?
Yeah, because sometimes there are data like which can be where you do not have suitable repositories, because sometimes authors might want to submit their data, but then they get rejections for the request because this is not a suitable repository. But then in those cases, what can be done,
I mean, there are general purpose repositories which will take any type of data unless it's not, for example, Zenodo is a very popular one. It will take any type of data up to 50 gigabyte for free.
Okay.
But I mean, maybe it's a very it's too extreme to say that upon request should be completely banned. But the problem is right now it's abused, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that it should be, if in your field data availability is sharing data is not common, I think it is better to allow authors to say data are not available, rather than make them claim something like data is available upon request, or which is also popular statement, all data is included in the article and the supplement, which is not the case because the supplement is often just a figure, a supplementary figure, and it's just not the data, at least the way I understand data. So in that sense, I think to be more honest, I think may be a good thing. If then some authors say it is available upon request, and at least they implement some kind of like functional email address so that there is a high probability that somebody is behind this request for a long time, I guess it would be fine. But I think there are so many ways to solve this along the way with different repositories that it should not be common. But if you have exhausted all others, maybe you will end up with a few articles where this is okay.
Thank you. We have another question from Dr. Paresh. Again, when we speak about data sharing, do we mean original data or interpreted data in a PDF file? Sharing original data without providing what data it is will not be useful for the users. For example, if we only share the FID file when recording an NMR spectrum, it would not be useful if we do not disclose to which molecule this NMR data belongs.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, if in the extreme case, if data is a table of numbers and it has no information whatsoever, it's completely useless. So I totally agree that data should be shared with metadata, and the disciplinary repositories will provide the respective metadata fields. I don't know much about NMR spectroscopy, but for example, for genetics, it will provide which gene or which chromosome it is, which animal model it is, which machinery or method this has been obtained with. So, and so this is why disciplinary repositories are the best. I definitely, when I talk about data sharing, I do explicitly not mean the sharing of PDFs with any content, because PDFs are not machine readable. So even if it has tables, for example, in our screening, if somebody shares a data table as a PDF, we do not consider it open data, because this is not machine readable and there are many low effort ways to do it better.
So another question we have, Anusarita. If the data used is too large, can the solvents formula provide a true representation of the data with a certain margin of error?
Maybe I didn't get the solvents formula.
Yes. solvents formula.
Okay. I'm not sure if this relates to something specifically from chemistry, um, but definitely I think that although there are repositories which take large data, this would require more disciplinary discussion. And as I mentioned before, I think in some cases it is necessary to share some kind of derived data. For example, for electron microscopy data, data can be terabyte, even petabyte, not quite petabyte, but over a whole project, there can be petabytes of data. So there will be no repository for those. And sharing them might then take place through other means. For example, recently I came across something which is a kind of like research torrent with like distributed data sharing. It might not be ideal in some ways, but it is a way of sharing very large data. Definitely, I do not claim that all data should be shared at the most raw level. Indeed, I also don't think that all data should be stored locally forever in the most raw state.
Okay. We have one more question. What problem if data is used before and are used again for another analysis?
I don't think that's really a problem, actually. I mean, it's a good thing. The author should just cite it properly.
Yeah,
That answers the question, or yeah.
I agree with that. Okay. Do we have more questions? Okay, I have one more. So, is there a differences in compliance and data availability between biomedical journals and other research fields?
Mm, Well, there are definitely in about data availability statements probably, but I don't have any exact knowledge about this. But for the actual data availability, definitely there are huge differences between fields. I mean, I can't say numbers off the top of my head, but I said the 10% that I named for our institution, it's maybe on the low end for biomedicine because we're relatively strict in our criteria. Depending on the criteria, you can, I mean, it's often a definitory question of definition. But if you don't include supplementary materials,
Mhm.
because supplementary materials are often not really data, and then you get into a really difficult discussion. But if you talk about repositories, then 10% is relatively realistic, maybe a bit more if you're more loose in the criteria. And then, I mean, even within biomedicine, there are huge differences. And because in genetics, omics fields, it's going to be often 30, 40, 50% of articles that have it. And in clinical trials, it's less than 1%. So even within this field and in other fields, again, you will have huge differences. But for example, recently I heard from somebody from botanics that for them it's like everybody shares data. I don't know, I haven't checked it. There are definitely studies, but I can't say you numbers for other fields from the top of my head.
And so, for example, also for simulation and modeling studies, like sometimes when I hear from the authors that these simulated data or modeling data might not be useful to deposit in the data repositories because authors might not, readers might not be able to understand it directly. They would need to help, so they need to get the request for that, and then they refuse to submit the data. So my first question is, what do you suggest in that case? And second, you think like GitHub and these repositories are the suitable repository to submit these simulated and modeling data?
So I think if you're talking generally about software and analysis code, I think definitely it should be deposited. And
Mhm.
I don't really buy into the argument, to be honest, that it can't be understood. I understand that authors might be afraid that they will be getting a lot of requests, but my experience doesn't show that people are getting so many requests. And B, if you're getting requests, then this is more than just reuse. Then this might also become a collaboration. You might really work on something and become a co-author. Like
Yeah.
because if you not just contribute but you really work with somebody, then it could be a basis for co-authorship. So I think this can actually be a benefit. But I think that the complication argument, I don't know. It might be true that 90% of the readers might not need or understand it, but what about the 10%, or what even about the 1%? So
Right.
I mean, I think we're all publishing research for experts, so we should assume that there are some experts out there. I think that GitHub is definitely very good in its functionality. Um, However, I would really recommend to authors to deposit at the time of article publication a snapshot, for example, on Zenodo, which makes it very clear which version has been used and
Okay.
also makes it citable. Because the problem with GitHub is A, it's not always clear which version has been used, and even more importantly, GitHub is not persistent. So if you change the structure of the repository in GitHub, you will already have a broken link. So this is really not a very good way of referring to software in an article. And I know that simulations and models are more than just software. And it's a kind of borderline between data and code. I'm not very much into this field, but I think in these cases, ideally, of course, it would be like a fully reproducible article where it's all in a Docker file. But if it's not possible, I think it should be published somewhere where the authors think it is most appropriate. I don't have a strong recommendations for that.
Okay. Thank you very much. We are still getting a lot of questions, but I'm so sorry I'm not able to take all the questions because we are running out of time. But I would like to thank you, Evgeny, for giving such a very wonderful information to all of us. And I'm sure if you have more questions, Evgeny can be reachable via email or I don't know, you can share if the viewers have more questions, that if they want to have your recommendation and suggestions, they can reach out to you maybe in future. Or
Definitely, please contact me, and I'll be happy to be in touch. Thanks for attending and thanks for the invite.
so do you see the poll from Mary? If you could quickly just fill it up, would be great. Great. That good to hear that they got to know from East Germany directly via email. Great. So thanks again. Thank you for your time. And we will have another course, another webinar in coming days. So one is on image integrity in the age of generative AI, which is on Tuesday, 16 September. And then we have another editorial school, which is in October. And then we're going to have another webinar for East German chapter and at the end of this month, on 30th September. This is going to be on clinical trial data. So keep watching and keep looking at your newsletters on LinkedIn or social media and do register for them. And thanks again for your time for today. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.